Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you to today's program, the Civil Rights Act at 60, a conversation with Dr. John Coverdale, sponsored by the Women in Law section, the Labor and Employment Law section, the Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Committee on Civil Rights, and the Committee on Continuing Legal Education of the New York State Bar Association. Today's program will run from 1 to 2 p.m. And at any point during the program, if you would like to pose a question to our speakers, please feel free to use the Q&A tab in the Zoom portal. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn it over to the newly elected chair of the Women in Law section, Fretra De Silva, to get things started with some opening remarks. Fretra?
Thanks so much, Ernesto, and thank you everyone for joining today. It's our pleasure to host Dr. Coverdale in this very important discussion regarding the Civil Rights Act's 60th anniversary. The Women in Law section is a very dynamic section which has been formed to advance women in the legal profession and all women under the law. The Women in Law section provides opportunities to address the professional, legal, policy, and legislative issues impacting women. We do this through a range of activities of our sponsored committees, from awards that are provided by the section to active members in the legal profession, to the General Counsel's Committee, a Gender Issues Committee, Partners Committee, many opportunities for people to get involved addressing issues that are important today and in the future, including some social events and book club meetings. So we welcome anyone to join us, women and men, to join us in furthering these activities. In addition, the WILS provides an opportunity for our members and for others to publish articles regarding relevant issues in our WILS Connect publication. So we welcome your contributions to that as well. Without further ado, I want to introduce Kim Wolf Price, our past chairperson of the Women in Law section. She is Chief Strategy and Diversity Officer at Bond, Schoeneck, and King. And that's it for me. Thank you so much, Kim, for leading us in this discussion. And thank you, Dr. Coverdale, for leading the discussion. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fretra. Thank you so much. And congratulations again on being chair of the Women in Law section for this year. I'm excited to work with you this year. Thanks to the Women in Law section for providing the space for our conversation as well. So the Women in Law section, as you heard, focuses efforts in the law pertaining to women and women attorneys. Many of these issues have an intersectional focus, meaning that the same law or regulation decision may impact individuals differently based on their many identities, be that race, gender, sexual identity, and more. We also discuss issues important to our profession overall, as well as business and society. So July 2nd, 2024 is the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. Signed on July 2, 1964 by President Lyndon B. Johnson, this law prohibited discrimination in public accommodations, called for the integration of schools and other public facilities, and made employment discrimination illegal. It is thought of as the most sweeping civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, and it forbade discrimination in employment based on race and sex. So we're commemorating this important 60th anniversary today with this fireside chat. And I'm thrilled and honored to have Dr. John Coverdale as our guest today. John is the president of the Center for Workplace Solutions. The Center for Workplace Solutions is a professional services consulting firm working with employers in business, government, and education sectors. His work focuses on labor arbitration and mediation, workplace dispute resolution, employee learning, and professional development. John is also a professor teaching in a number of complementary areas. In addition to all of that is how I first met Dr. Coverdale. He is a consultant and speaker using his knowledge and experience to direct conversations on a variety of important topics, including diversity, equity, and inclusion, and belonging in the workplace and beyond. So John, thank you for joining the Women in Law section today for this conversation.
Thank you, Kim. It's always a pleasure to work with you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. It's really important and something I have great passion for.
I appreciate that, and that's why you're the perfect person to have this conversation with us today. So we met, I think, about a year and a half ago or so now. Yes. We were asked to speak, right, at the New York State School Attorneys Conference.
Yes.
And we were in the Adirondacks, and our topic was implicit bias. I think, we made a good speaking duo.
Agreed.
And that topic, implicit bias generally, and for each of us, it remains an important discussion in all discussions surrounding civil rights, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And as I look at the Civil Rights Act, this was a long stride for progress and with a focus on heightened civility. But we can't look at the Civil Rights Act as a law that was passed in 1964 without looking at some of the history that led to the signing of the Civil Rights Act. We had executive orders signed by President Roosevelt. We had some executive orders signed by President Truman, and we had President Kennedy, who signed the Equal Pay Act in 1963, which was another attempt to eliminate discrimination in the workplace based on gender. And then we have the Civil Rights Act, which prior to the bill that we now know, President Kennedy had submitted 2 bills to Congress. The first languished for, I believe, close to a year, and the second one, President Johnson actually changed and was able to get passed in part as a memorial to President Kennedy, who obviously at that point had been assassinated.
I think that's also important. I'm glad we'll be able to have more of that conversation today, because it's history that I didn't know about. But before we get to that, I think your background really speaks to why this was important to you. And why I didn't want to give your whole bio because I could have kept going. So do you want to talk a little bit more about where your background, where you grew up, school, your graduate work, whatever you think sort of is important here?
I'm a native Long Islander, and I still reside on Long Island. And I did my undergraduate work in Connecticut at the University of New Haven, bachelor's degree in business administration. I have a master's degree in business administration, a master's degree in human resource management, graduate certificate in organizational behavior, doctorate in educational leadership. And my doctoral dissertation was on affirmative action. It was a look at a study of affirmative action as public policy and its impact in business, government, and education.
That education was an important part of your life always because of your parents?
Yes, my parents were both educators. They met in college, and my mother was actually recruited to Long Island to teach, and she taught in the Middle Country School District initially before moving to Center Moriches and then Mount Sinai. But she taught phys ed. She became a guidance counselor, and then she taught 6th grade. When my parents got married, my mother was already living here. My father was finishing his senior year in college. And she said, well, I have a job, so you're going to obviously be moving up here, and there are plenty of teaching jobs available. And they got married in late August of 1960. And for their honeymoon, they came to Long Island to, put their house together. My mother had found a house that they rented. And obviously at that point in the school year, there weren't very many teaching jobs. But the following year, my father started to apply for teaching jobs, and he was struggling to find one. And then he had a phone interview, and he was hired over the phone in an all-white school district. And when he showed up, the board had an emergency school board meeting they didn't know he was a Black or an African American. And this was an all-white school district. So he survived the vote. There was, I think, a 5-member board, and 2 people voted to terminate, 2 people voted to keep him, and the board president only voted when there was a tie, voted to keep him. So, and he had a spectacular career there. He coached football, basketball, and about 10 years into his teaching career, they asked him to come into administration, where he spent the rest of his career becoming the principal of that high school, assistant superintendent. So he had a spectacular run.
And did you serve on the school board in the same district?
I did. And actually, the year my father retired, I was elected. So I think, election day was in May or late April.
Yep,
May. It wasn't the second Tuesday or whatever it is back then. That was before the law. But
that's right.
so for a brief period of time, I technically was my father's boss because he didn't retire until July 1st. So, but I was voted onto the board, and I'll admit, the first time it was probably more of a vote for him than it was a vote for me. The second time I ran for re-election and won by an overwhelming margin. And I spent 4 years as the president of the Board of Education. And ironically, the individual who I just mentioned who broke the tie to keep my father employed in the school district, that was the same seat he held 30 years prior.
I think that story is so powerful, but especially in light of this conversation today on the 1964 Act, because as you mentioned, it was prior to that. And
it drives me, and I've shared this with you, it drives me more than I'm even able to articulate in both my professional work and personally, because prior to becoming a labor mediator and an arbitrator, I was an HR consultant. So my entire career, I've worked in human resources or labor relations, and exclusively, except for a 3.5 or so year stint in government, this is the only discipline I really know. And we always talk to people about implicit bias and unconscious bias. And in the interview process, if my father had showed up for a traditional interview in 1960, and by traditional I mean in person, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have gotten that job. No matter how well he may have presented himself, no matter how well he may have articulated his responses, no matter how qualified he may have been. And I'm going to put qualified in air quotes because it sometimes is a term of art, and it is often subjective. So I'm sure he would have gotten a job somewhere, but I don't know that he would have gotten a job in that particular district if he had interviewed in person. And that's really part of his story, because he spent his whole career there and did some unique things. He started the football program, or helped to start it with his friend who was a physical educator, coached some winning basketball. In the late 60s, the principal asked him to come into administration, and the qualification was, whenever you have cafeteria duty, we don't seem to have any problems. So, would you come and be a member of, my administrative team? He wasn't even certified. So they created a position for him to get around the law, that you had to have certification while he completed his certification. So one vote is sort of why I'm here. That's such a critical part of my story.
I think it's such an important context for the conversation on the Civil Rights Act as well. And I really appreciate you sharing that with everyone, because at once, we think 60th anniversary, that was a while ago, but then in so many ways, it is recent history and still impacting that.
Well, I can share with you and the audience, because you use the word history, and this Civil Rights Act was signed within my lifetime. So I know you well enough to know that you're not calling me old, but
I'm definitely not. We're not that far off.
but at the same time, it is very recent history in my mind. So the things that happen within one's lifetime, we don't necessarily always consider long ago. But the impact of the Civil Rights Act, I was a nosy kid. I was always trying to listen in on what my parents or their friends were talking about. Always in, as the kids say today, you're in the grown folks conversations or in grown folks business. But one of the things that I recall about my childhood is that my parents talked about the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, and my parents insisted on traveling. And, we loaded up at the time we had a Volkswagen Bug, and we loaded up the Volkswagen Bug, playpen in the back and everything, because I have a younger sister, and drove all over the Northeast. And my parents had very clear conversations about hotel chains. And this wasn't a green book situation like in the South, but we were very keen to the fact that there were some national hotel chains that said early on, we're going to comply with the newly signed act. And Howard Johnson's, which isn't even around anymore, but Holiday Inn and the Sheraton were three. We had the pamphlets, the national pamphlets in our glove box at all times. So by state, you knew where every Holiday Inn was or every Howard Johnson's was, and my parents had those conversations right in front of me because they also shared that prior to that, sometimes they would arrive at the hotel, even having a reservation, and find out that there was not a room available. So, you know, within my lifetime, we have this, look, there's still a lot of work to do, but I'm not one who will ignore or deny the fact that there has been progress, and some significant progress in many ways, legislatively and socially and politically. And even though some days now that's difficult to discern, it is true.
Yeah, I think it's so important though to learn and about the act, and I hope that you'll tell us more about that history as well and how it got there. But would you mind talking a little bit about the act itself? I mean, I think we all generally know what it is, but talk about some of the major points of the Civil Rights Act.
Well, the Civil Rights Act at its core is designed to prohibit discrimination in employment and in public accommodations, as we just discussed. And in employment, we talk about discrimination, race, national origin, religion, and color. The law also states that sex discrimination based on sex is prohibited, but that was added at the last minute. So for, you know, there was no, in any of the original bills, there was not a clear intent to prevent discrimination based on gender, although they did eventually include the term sex, which is akin, I guess, to gender, is one way to look at it. But that wasn't in the initial, in some of the initial drafts of the bill. It was included at the last minute.
It is interesting how these develop, and I've learned a lot about the 1964 Act from our conversations about the legislative and presidential history. I hope that we can talk about a little bit about that, and then, of course, also how the Civil Rights Act has spawned and been a real bedrock for other civil rights movements. But will you tell us a little bit about that? I didn't realize, honestly, all the way back to FDR, that there were pieces that were happening that sort of led us on this path. Will you talk a little bit about that perspective that got us to 1964?
Well, the President Roosevelt was paid a visit by A. Philip Randolph, then the president of the Association of Sleeping Car Porters. And there was actually a March on Washington that was planned in the 1940s, 1941, I believe, to put a spotlight on the discrimination, in some cases in the military and certainly in public accommodations and so forth. And Philip Randolph said, you know, I'm going to bring about 125 or 150 of my close friends to Washington, D.C. so that the whole country knows how we feel. And President Roosevelt didn't want that. So they had this, this ongoing attempt to figure out how to eliminate or reduce discrimination. So we had the Civil Rights Act. Leading up to that document in 1964, we had a couple of executive orders. And Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, President Truman, all presidents have faced discrimination and in-group, out-group, disparate treatment in our country's history. Some presidents have done more to try to address it, and some presidents, for political reasons or otherwise, have not always been on the forefront of it, which is one of the reasons why President Kennedy strikes me as critical to our history when it comes to civil rights, because, and we're overlooking momentarily the fact that he was a child of privilege, of immense privilege, and his father was one of the wealthiest people in the country. So he probably didn't interact in any meaningful fashion with Black or brown people, and but he was a student of history, and he was, although he probably also was pushed by his brother, but there was a lot going on during his presidency that put civil rights in a different context, and he tried to react to it. And I've often wondered whether, if Nixon had won in 1960, whether there would have been a Civil Rights Act at that time, or when may a law of that magnitude have been passed if Nixon had won in 1960, because it's well documented that he had different philosophies than Kennedy on this issue. So I think that's very important. And then Kennedy also made some critical speeches about civil rights, and so did Harry Truman. President Truman made some critical speeches about civil rights, and signing an executive order that, I believe his quote was, "It had teeth in it," And so we can see the momentum from around, and that's not to say that discrimination or exclusion started in the 1940s. Obviously, it happened long before that, but we can see from the early 1940s the executive orders and presidential actions in many cases that led to the signing of the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. And we also had on either side, of the Civil Rights Act, you had the Equal Pay Act, which was Kennedy's attempt to eliminate disparities in pay based on gender. And you had the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So it was an interesting period of time where you saw that the government was striving for what I call heightened civility. Some people would call it reduced incivility, but either way, you saw that there was some action in our government, in our elected officials, particularly at the federal level, and the Civil Rights Bill. At the state level, most of your workplace policies specific to hostile work environment or harassment stems from the Civil Rights Bill. So you have the state and local level that have replicated a lot of the core tenets of the Civil Rights Act when it comes to workplace hostilities and harassment and discrimination.
I think that the piece about President Kennedy, it speaks to so much of what you and I have talked about, and when we've presented together on implicit bias, and that ability to get a little bit uncomfortable and to see outside of yourself in order to make real change. And as you pointed out, it wasn't something he needed to do, but it was something that he recognized. Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, that's an excellent point. And it brings me, I go to the Kennedy Museum library in Boston frequently. I've actually lost count of how many times I've been there. And sometimes I go just for an hour, if I'm in the area or anywhere nearby, to sit and listen and try to learn, because that whole period of time was just so critical to my professional development. As I said earlier, everything I've done for now close to a 40-year career is in some way, shape, or form having to do with people and organizations. And I'm thankful that Kennedy had, whatever his shortcomings and faults may have been as a president, and every president has had some, he also had an open mind. And he could have ignored this issue for his own political benefit. He could have done a lot of things that would not have resulted in us having this bill. He sent not one, but two bills to Congress. But you have to think about the things that were happening during his presidency, and not just during his presidency, but they peaked. The civil rights movement peaked during his presidency. Bus boycott, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, their anniversary, I believe, was this month also, or is soon to be the anniversary of their murder. You had the Montgomery bus boycott. You had sit-ins. You had burnings and bombings and lynchings and so forth. And NAACP chapter presidents assassinated right in their own driveways, yards from their young children and their wife. This was a very difficult, let me be more direct, ugly period of time for our country. And to have been the president, to have had a president during that time that wanted to react in some way, shape, or form to it, I think was really important. And the Civil Rights Act is imperfect, but I look at it now as the pathway to some sustainability. It was, if you read the Civil Rights Act if you read it in 1964 when it first was drafted, I'm sure some people thought this was futuristic in a way. And now you look at it and you read it and you say, thank you. That there was obviously an intent to try to heighten civility that I think is very clear, but it also brings us to this moment that we're in right now, because when people talk about COVID and post-COVID, there's a lot that's happened in the last 10 years, and the demographic has changed. There are more women in the workplace. We have 4 generations now in the workplace, which is probably the second or perhaps the third time in our country's history. You may have had 4 generations in the workplace during the Industrial Revolution, but people weren't living as long, and people were starting work earlier. So you had 8, 9, 10 year old children who were working full time. My kids have never cut grass. Right. So it's or rake leaves or done any of the things that even our generation, I'm sure, had to do. So if you say you have 4 generations, people are working longer, in some cases because they have to, which is sad, in other cases because they want to, and they also are living longer. So, we have to take a look at that as a sign of progress. But then it brings us to these ongoing conversations about diversity and equity and inclusion and unconscious bias. And so despite the laws, if you look at the EEOC data, and the EEOC was created by the passage of the Civil Rights Act, there's still increases in the number of complaints they're receiving. And that's not to say that the complaints are founded, but there's increases in the number. So it wasn't just COVID and the Great Resignation, the so-called Great Resignation that we've been dealing with. It also was in the midst of the George Floyd protest. It very shortly followed the Time's Up movement, and so these other social protests that were happening, but these are all the offspring of the Civil Rights Act, where we have people who are deciding we want to be more assertive. We're reacting to our real, in many cases, and imagined in other cases, circumstances that we have some consternation over. So this is a critical period that we're in, and implicit bias was what brought you and I together. And I think today, because of the Civil Rights Act, we're discussing things like implicit bias, which we all have and all need to work on, which I think are going to help continue to put us on that path to being a better society.
Yeah, more civility. I keep coming back in my head to that that idea that, it's no one's perfect, no president's perfect, but it's an example of, Kennedy is an example of using your privilege, acknowledging and perhaps overcoming your implicit bias to do the thing that's right, and to use your capital, your privilege, to help make change.
Right.
And I think that that's partially what this sort of stands for as well.
Even, I mean, the civil rights, we talk about women's sports. So today we have professional level sports, the WNBA, the NBA, high schools in some cases have a women's flag football team.
Yes.
I mean, there's still some inequities. I mean, take a look at the WNBA, the salaries, there's no, LeBron James level salary in the WNBA. And they've had recent improvements, but the locker rooms are probably closer to being the same. The equipment and the facilities are probably closer to being the same. And that's not justification. It's just an expression of the realities that there's still ongoing progress. And that should be attributed to the Civil Rights Act as well, even though women were not initially included. Keep in mind, there were, I don't think, any women in Congress or the Senate at the time this bill was passed. And so you still, like at many times in our country's history, had a bunch of men sitting around and, just sort of signed off on something that they, spent. And the Civil Rights Act was discussed and filibustered and argued about for quite some time, but it was still passed by men. And quite frankly, none of the men looked like me. And something else that people don't really know is that the March on Washington in 1963, where Dr. King made his delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, that was planned to get Congress to pass Kennedy's bill. You had 250,000 people that showed up in Washington, D.C. and didn't even leave a candy wrapper. And there were no incidents. And people came from all over the country, and buses came in from all over the country, and some people drove or took the train on a hot August day. I'm always fascinated when I watch the footage because most of the men have suits and ties on. On a Sunday in August in Washington, D.C., where there wasn't any shade, and I think the temperature was 80-something degrees. So I take that as an indication of how desirous people were for social change. And it's too easy even today to look at protests and say, well, I don't agree with whatever it is that they're protesting. And we've had some ugly and violent and protests, and nobody is condoning that. But at the core, what is it that people are striving for? I mean, it's equality. I mean, the Supreme Court just a few years ago decided that same-sex marriage was legal. We have females who are now serious candidates for the presidency of the United States. You had, starting with Hillary Clinton, and there were other women who ran for the presidency, but I don't think they reached the level of getting a party's nomination. Geraldine Ferraro is the vice president candidate. So there's progress here. Is it moving at a fast enough pace? Not for me. But at the same time, in part because you and I have talked about inclusion, we all know people who I suspect are struggling with the pace of progress, or who feel that they've been left out of that progress, or that they're no longer the focal point of society, or no longer can identify with excellence in our society. And we're dealing with a lot. So change causes tension. Tension usually seeks some sort of manifestation. In many cases, is not productive. So I try, and I admit that it's work some days, but when I listen to the news and I take an assessment of what's going on, I try not to be judgmental. And I'm a workplace investigator. I used to get, and by used to, I mean, up to about 5 years ago, I got somewhere between 12 and 15 investigations a year. I did 48 last year, 44 the year before. So they were going back to 2022. So something is happening, and the workplace is a microcosm of society. So all that, we turn on the news, you see frustration, you see a protest, you see, somebody that's acted inappropriately in response to them feeling their rights have been abrogated in some way, shape, or form. All that ends up in the workplace. All of it.
Oh, that is true. And the act sort of noticed that, right? Because it was one of that's where change has to take place. It brings people together. We spend so much of our lives in our workplaces.
Yes. And the other factor is the implicit bias, and sometimes people get defensive, and I understand that, but I don't agree with it, because good people have biases. I consider myself to be a good person. I know without question that you are. And you and I have had very open conversations about our biases. And when we talk about discrimination in employment, there are times and there are ways where candidates are eliminated by an interviewer because of interviewer bias. And in many cases, they're not even aware of it. So, I mean, if you have a bias against women, or a bias against people of color, or biased against people because of their age, you can take those same prohibited constructs from the Civil Rights Act in '64 and apply them to your unconscious bias. And while you may not be intending to discriminate, while you may not be conducting yourself in the same way that Bull Connor or somebody in the 1960s or 1950s did, the potential exists nonetheless that you're doing a person harm in the workplace because of their fill in the blank. Oh. Their fill in the blank from the same language used in the Civil Rights Act, their race, their color, their religious beliefs, their national origin. And it happens painfully, and I've been guilty of it too. But it happens painfully more than people realize, and that's why even the conversations and the trainings that people are going through on DEI, that all stems from the Civil Rights Act.
And well, I think that your dad's story is so important here, like that you started with that, because it's an example of exactly what you're talking about. But the phone connection was one because there were similarities, right? There were ways, and we have to take a step back sometimes and ask ourselves the why questions. Why am I coming to this decision? Right?
You absolutely do. And I use that story not because it's my dad, and personally, I thought he was a pretty cool guy.
Yeah. He must have been.
But there's power in the story from an HR perspective, because you had two males over the phone. They both were veterans, different wars, Korea, in my father's case, World War II, and the superintendent's case. They both, the superintendent, before going into administration, was a history teacher. My father was trying to get a job as a history teacher. They both were college athletes. So they bonded over the phone without seeing each other. And the superintendent, even when he did meet my father, still liked him immensely, but that potential for discrimination in 1961, where if he walked in, he wouldn't have gotten the job, I'm sure, despite him even being the most qualified, perhaps he wouldn't have gotten that job. And people, I think, sometimes use the word qualifications to their advantage. You know, you weren't the most, and I'm a professor of organizational behavior, and people say, well, we should just give the job, shouldn't we just give the job to the most qualified? Yes, we should. But too many people assume they were the most qualified. In some cases, they were the most qualified, and that's why they got the job. In other cases, it was their golf score, or where they went to college, or who's in their father's country club, and it could also be that on any given day, you just stunk up the interview a little less than everybody else. Congrats, you're hired.
That's so true. Exactly.
But and I don't want people to think that that is akin to discrimination.
Right.
But it certainly fits into the unconscious bias category. And I think if you fall short in addressing or being cognizant of your unconscious biases, you might still be a good person, but you've done other good people harm.
Right. And that's where that like moment of pause or learning from those around us or using our privilege or our social capital or whatever comes in so important. And I think back to, you know, Kennedy, the March on Washington, and then suddenly you're Lyndon B. Johnson, and this hasn't passed yet. But in some ways, he did it because of the capital Kennedy had sort of risked. Mm-hmm. And it was an honor to him. That was part of it, wasn't it?
It was. And Lyndon Johnson first spoke of passing his desire to have that bill passed 5 days after he took office. So late November, early December was when he spoke to the nation. He mentioned it then. And Lyndon Johnson also spoke openly about affirmative action, but affirmative action was a term that first came up in one of Kennedy's executive orders, that he wanted affirmative action, that there were suppliers who were getting government money and they were still discriminating against people, particularly in the construction industry. So, so when we look at the history, I love that period of time because I do sense that there's progress. I am appreciative of the progress. But I also, and someone asked me this just the other night, so I think I was in 7th grade and I wasn't quite finished a history assignment that was due, within a couple days. I was a last minute type, despite the fact that my parents are educators, or maybe because of it in a way.
Yeah, but, maybe.
What's the saying? Educators sometimes have the worst kids. But so my mother invited another couple that they were friendly with, who also were both educators, and Bob and my father worked in the same school, and obviously we're in the same department because he was a history teacher. Mm-hmm. And they asked after dinner, what are you working on? I was in the middle school, I guess, at the time, and I told them, we were studying the Civil War, and in fact, I had a report due. And my father said, how far along are you? Or maybe I should ask, how far along aren't you? And he said, go upstairs and get your notebook. And I wish I still had the notes, but the two of them had this intense conversation about the Civil War. And, I sort of took notes. So they gave me this like 30-minute, back and forth. And I took notes and was able to get my paper finished in time. But my parents' friend, Bob, asked my father, what did he think the impact would have been if the Reconstruction period had been allowed to go longer than it did. So it was a approximate 7-year period that was designed to, post the Civil War to reconstruct society. And so 7 years to address, I think, 220 years worth of social inequities. Obviously, as I'm an organizational behavior, specialist, we talk about the failure in organizations. 78% of all change efforts in organizations fall short. And I'm not prepared to say that this one fell short, but I am prepared to say that it didn't go far enough.
Mhm.
So from 1863 through 69 or so, 70, to 1964, that's how long it took
Right.
to achieve in legislation the attempt to address the societal inequities.
And that's a really powerful way to look at it. One of the other things that you mentioned is we're getting closer to time here, is you alluded to it earlier, and you and I have talked about it, is that the 1964 Act was sort of also the basis by which other civil rights movements they owe a lot to that, which of course owes a lot to the history of the Civil Rights Act itself. But what would you have any comments about that, about how more recent civil rights movements have really owed a lot to that 64 Act and that time period in our history?
Well, I think not just the act, but I would attribute it to the attempts at remedy that were going on during the civil rights movement also.
Definitely.
And, you know, you see it today sometimes in protests, the call and response, you know, that people are using,
Yeah.
the marching and the signs that people are using. We owe a lot to, and some people don't agree with this, and I'm fine with that, but we owe a lot to the attempts at remedy that were going on during that period of time. Yes, they resulted in a landmark piece of legislation that is imperfect, but we have, for example, the 1978 Pregnancy Discrimination Act. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act. We have the Family Medical Leave Act. That those are also subsequent attempts at remedy, which stem, and some people consider them to be extensions of the Civil Rights Act. And I don't think it's altogether inappropriate to disagree.
Yeah, because it was there was so many pieces working. So, everything from the civil rights movement to whatever was happening behind the scenes that we don't know about, all
Right.
trying to come together to move something forward. And it's a way to learn about how we can make change,
Right.
even
And,
if it's imperfect.
well, that's exactly the point. So we went from racial and gender discrimination, ongoing discussions about sexual preference, ongoing conversations about in-group and out-group disparities, and then included affirmative action and included a lot of other attempts. And today we're talking about diversity and equity and inclusive workplaces, and being aware of our biases and attempting to be, and it's really an emotional intelligence construct also, but attempting to be more aware of our differences without allowing ourselves to use those differences to attribute or to include or exclude individuals. So I think where we are right now is critically important, but I think, and people don't want to discuss the history, and I get it, but for me, we got to this point. We got to a better place because of legislation like the Civil Rights Bill, like the Pregnancy Discrimination Act that President Carter signed, like the Equal Pay Act. And it's two ways to look at it. You can look at it and say, well, the government had to be forced, or we had to be forced to do these things. That's true. It didn't happen organically. But let's not ignore the fact that it did occur, and they are now federal laws designed to address these inequities. And even with the Equal Pay Act, we still have the wage gap.
Even larger for women of color, particularly Black women.
Right, and that's unfortunate and it's sad. But the gap has also narrowed.
Mm-hmm.
over the course of time. How long should it have taken? Yes, this has been too long, but we are a work in progress.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. We are a work in progress. I think that a lot of times with a law, it's, we say the letter of the law is what you have to comply with, but sometimes the spirit of the law is what takes us further, right? The reasons why, the lessons learned. And that's why I think personally, looking back at the 64 Act, celebrating it, understanding its imperfections, but thinking about how we got there and then what changes come from there is important to figure out what's next.
Think about the foundations of the Civil Rights Act that are in your workplace policies. Most of the people who are online today, their workplace policies, it's in every workplace that you can't discriminate based on, those same categories that are identified in the Civil Rights Act. And it's the foundation of your harassment policies, your anti-harassment policies, and your anti-discrimination policies. And yes, there are things that are still happening, but this was a law that's still guiding us in our workplaces and in our society, and will continue to do so. And I think it's helping guide us now towards sustainability. That's really the important part. I mean, as the demographic change, the protests have put us in a better position. All these protests that are going on have helped put us in a better position. In New York State, you have your sexual harassment training that's required annually. Those are all outgrowths of the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Act, and the desire for greater accountability and sustainability.
Yeah, I would even say that the New York this year, on the ballot is the Equal Rights Amendment to include women and other groups in our state's constitution for the first time. Strange that it's 60 years after the Civil Rights Act, but it's part of that conversation that's been going on.
There was also a New Yorker that helped draft the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
Emmanuel Seller, Democrat from New York, who helped draft the Civil Rights Act. He, I believe, lost a re-election because he did not support the ongoing women's movement at the time. But he did draft the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's what we've talked about, right? It's sort of knowing your own, sometimes people call implicit bias, your own myopia, right? Noticing the parts where you're being a little short-sighted on things. And so maybe he learned that after that experience a little bit as well.
Well, and that's what happens.
Yes, exactly. Well, as we talked about the 60th anniversary, and the history, I think, is so important to understand. And I really appreciate you sharing this all with us today. And for me, I've learned a lot through our conversations because I didn't study the 64 Act in the way you have, right? I've studied it as a lawyer and what we have to comply with. But I think it's really important to see the broader picture. So what are some of your thoughts as we move forward past the 60th anniversary?
I use the word agility a lot. And I encourage your listeners to continue to be more self-aware and more organizationally aware. And I don't mean that just in their respective organizations. I mean for their clients, that lawyers, employment lawyers in particular, can play such a crucial role in this continued transition of heightened civility in the workplace. And I'm formerly an HR consultant, and I think that's a critically important role in any organization. But you are in that role sometimes comforted when the attorney representing the organization reaches out and says, "Hey, let's just have a cup of coffee. How are things happening? What's your employment record? What's your employment data saying about who's here and who isn't, or retention rates, or how many complaints have you had about discrimination or harassment or whatever? Do you see any patterns?" There's so many critical conversations that progressive organizations should be having in these, even especially during these challenging times. And there's so much good that I suspect is going to come from this moment, despite the difficulty. There's a lot of good that can come from this moment. And as the demographic trends continue, progressive organizations that have spent time talking about some of these issues, I think will be in a better position going forward than organizations that haven't.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful statement. We talked a lot about how sometimes change isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. And sometimes we have to get used to being a little uncomfortable. And I think the 1964 Act is one way, but it's a big way. I hope that we can acknowledge that and hopefully move forward from there.
Agreed.
Thank you so much, John. Sincere thanks for joining the Women in Law section today to commemorate the Civil Rights Act of 1964's 60th anniversary. I look forward to working with you again soon. Thank you so much.
Same here, Kim. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
So I'm going to now turn the program over to Laura Sulam, co-chair of the Women in Law section's annual meeting and programming committee, for our closing remarks. Hi, Laura.
Hi, thanks so much. I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you, Dr. Coverdale, and to thank you, Kim, for this really informative and very interesting conversation on the Civil Rights Act. Really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you who have joined us today. And I want to make a quick plug for another program that the Women in Law section is hosting this Thursday, June 27th at 12 p.m. on law practice through the eyes of Gen Z. It's for 1 CLE credit, and sure to be a great conversation. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, John. Bye.